Hello and welcome everyone. We'll let folks join here before we get started. We'll get started in a minute or two, but thanks for joining us early in the morning on a Friday, at least here in Washington. All right. Good morning and welcome to a roundtable discussion on the security implications of the Pakistan floods. My name is Erin Sikorsky. I am the director of the Center for Climate and Security, which is an institute of the Council on Strategic Risks based here in Washington, D.C. And we're really pleased to have you join us this morning for this webinar to discuss an issue that is at the front of everyone's mind, I think, in the national security community who focuses on South Asia and the world more generally, is how our climate change hazards, how our climate change events, such as the flooding in Pakistan earlier this fall, affecting the security risks in those countries and beyond. And so I'm really pleased to moderate a wonderful panel today of experts to talk about how we think about the second and third order impacts and risks of events like the unprecedented flooding we've seen in Pakistan, which submerged 1/3 of the entire country underwater, which is about the size of the UK, just for comparison's sake. One early attribution study has linked this disaster to climate change already, finding that the severity of flooding is extremely unlikely without the existing global temperature rise. Of course, this has led to devastating humanitarian costs in the country, and that is not the end of the potential risks, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So what I'm going to do, because you're all here not to hear me, but to listen to our expert panelists, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in turn with their name and title, and then we're going to move through a series of questions and conversation to hear from them and their expert viewpoints on those second and third order security and political risks. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Folks can add questions into the Q&A box through the webinar. I'll keep an eye on those. We'll hopefully have some questions from the panelists to each other as well. And just a reminder that this is on the record. It is being recorded and will be available for folks to watch after the session is over on our website at the Center for Climate and Security and the Council on Strategic Risks. So let me introduce our wonderful panelists. First, we'll be hearing from Ameera Adil, who is the Assistant Director of Sustainability at the National University of Sciences and Technology in Pakistan. We'll also be hearing from Faraz Haider, who is a research associate at the Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies at the Air University in Islamabad. And if you haven't read the piece that the two of them wrote earlier this month on the South Asian Voices blog of the Stimson Center, which talks exactly about the intersection of national security and climate change risks in response to the floods, you really should check it out. I'm hoping both of them will speak to it a little bit today because it's so wonderful. Our other two speakers, we have Andrea Rezzonico, who is my colleague and the Deputy Director of the Converging Risks Lab here at the Council on Strategic Risks. And we also have Jumaina Siddiqui, who is a Senior Program Officer for South Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And she also has written a wonderful piece, I believe it was on just security earlier this fall, that laid out some of the governance issues related to the floods and how we could take lessons learned from the 2010 floods in Pakistan moving forward. I should have mentioned too, Andrea co-authored a piece with me on the security implications of the Pakistan floods, which is available on the CCS website. So again, lots of great information out there, lots of great writing, and now we can have a conversation about these security risks and where we go from here. So I'm going to turn to Ameera first to get us started, and I'm going to ask her to paint a picture of the current state of the crisis in Pakistan and talk a bit about what security risks local communities are experiencing in the wake of these unprecedented floods.
Thank you, Erin. Well, to start off with some facts and figures up to date that we have, 1,600 people so far have died from the floods. 12,000 people have been injured from the floods. 550,000 people have been displaced, and overall 33 million people, and more than that, have been affected by the floods, and more to come. So 800,000 houses have been damaged, and 88% of that loss is borne by the province of Sindh, which is almost completely underwater at this moment, like you mentioned. A tenth of Pakistan is not just underwater, but will remain underwater for the next few months as the water goes down or evaporates. So it's a devastating situation because this is just 1 degree to 1.2 degrees of warming that we're seeing, and we're projected with our current emissions patterns that we're not going to be staying less than 2 degrees of warming, stopping at less than 2 degrees of warming. So it's really alarming because where are the people of Pakistan supposed to go when most of our country is drowning? And people here are literally on the sides of the highways in tents, in makeshift tents. They have nowhere to go, nothing to eat, nothing to drink, and the security risks that come out of this, the most dangerous one that I'm seeing so far are the diseases. So I've seen diseases in children. I've seen pictures of diseases in children that I've never seen before in my life. Their skin ruined by I don't even know what. But one of the bigger risks is dengue and malaria. I myself recovered from dengue. I am recovering from dengue as we speak, and it's terrible because it drains you of your energy and causes severe dehydration. It's very fatal, especially to someone who's homeless. So in Pakistan, there are literally cyclones of mosquitoes that you can see visibly over flood affected areas, and there is literally nowhere to run because there's no dry land in them. And then you have hunger and thirst. There's no access to food. There's no way that we can get food over there. And the problem with like delivering aid to these flood affected areas is that it's not that we're slow in delivering aid, it's more that the impacted area and the number of people is so huge that we can't possibly reach all of them and reach all of the affected areas. And it's really devastating because I have colleagues in the development sector who are working day and night. They don't have weekends anymore. They're working around the clock to deliver goods and aid to these people, and still it doesn't seem to be enough. On the long run, we're seeing a rise in poverty, a rise in homelessness, unemployment, school dropouts is a big thing to look at here. And then we have child marriages and violence against women that will surely increase because of these events. So the impacts on national security are pretty evident over here because with the growing frustration within the people who are affected by the floods, the effectees, and the little support that they're getting despite our best efforts is due to turn into a long-term political or socioeconomic instability situation. That's my perspective on this.
Thanks so much, and thanks for painting that sobering picture of what things are looking like on the ground. I think that's really important to ground our discussion today. I'd like to move to Jumaina next to talk a little bit about the ways in which the climate impacts are intersecting with other kinds of risk, because the full scope of the crisis is not about climate alone. And could you talk to some of the most concerning intersections that you see between climate and other factors?
Sure, thank you. And I'm glad that Ameera brought up long-term political instability, because that is what I think is a major factor in the fact that there wasn't adequate planning. In the spring of this year, Pakistan did see a change in government. The now opposition leader, former Prime Minister Imran Khan's government, through an act of parliament, was removed from office, and his party then moved to the opposition, and they're still not participating fully in parliament. So in this time when governments should be legislating on the provincial and national level, there has been political instability, changes in government, not just on the national level, but on the provincial level, especially in Punjab, which wasn't as hard hit as Sindh and Balochistan. But again, the instability in one province and on the national level does seep throughout the entire country. and the former prime minister's political party is also leading the government in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which is also hit very hard from the floods. So all of this political instability compounded any planning for the floods. And of course, I've made this case everywhere I've talked, or everywhere, no country, not even the United States, can prepare for the level of the rainfall and the flooding, the damage and devastation that Pakistan has seen. And we're seeing that in Florida as well. As much as the Florida state government has been trying to plan, and FEMA and the national government, they cannot adequately plan for the types of climate-related disasters we are seeing and will see in the future. But for Pakistan, it's a combination of the political instability we're seeing. And I think just a lack, not of political will, but of the foresight to think about that these floods and these rainfalls are getting worse every year. So you had 2010, but you also had 2020, which was a lot of urban flooding. In places like Karachi and in Lahore, you also had flooding, not to this level, and increased rainfall. Additionally, I think there's been disconnects between places and institutions like the Pakistan Meteorological Office, which has been issuing warnings, not just about the rainfall, but the heat wave that took place prior to these extreme monsoon rains that took place in June, July, and into August, and so that compounded those. Adequate planning for the heat wave was not done. Adequate planning for the floods were not done. For example, the Disaster Management Authority on the provincial level in Sindh, which was set up after the 2010 floods. So the National Disaster Management Authority and its equivalent provincial arms were set up after the 2010 floods. The Sindh Provincial Disaster Management Authority prepared for the monsoons, and tents for 70,000 families. At kind of the peak of the rainfall and the floods, 3.3 million people needed tents. So just that disconnect. And this is, even if they were able to plan and prepare adequately, another issue that has faced Pakistan and many countries, not just in South Asia, but around the world, is just the rising inflation, food security issues. The war in Ukraine has also impacted the ability for imports of wheat and grain, and just economic instability overall. The new government came in, was trying to negotiate a new deal with the IMF, tried to shore up its foreign reserves. So the focus of the government was also on just keeping Pakistan from not delving into the territory where Sri Lanka ended up in. And that was kind of their laser guided tunnel vision at that time. And so while some people were thinking about it, it was not the priority of the Pakistani government, and rightly so. To keep 220 million people in an economy supporting 220 million people afloat is very important. So that, I think, was kind of the risk that compounded the relief efforts, the preparation, and the relief efforts that will need to happen over the months and probably years to come in the reconstruction, as Ameera has mentioned.
Thanks for those remarks, which really, I think, helped show that this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? That there's all these other things going on that shape the impacts and how challenging it is. Faraz, I'd like to turn to you now to talk about the role that the military is playing in responding to the flooding, and your perspective in the midst of this crisis. What security risks are you most concerned about in Pakistan?
Thanks, Erin. So just historically, the military in Pakistan, as in other countries, is very crucial in any sort of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operation, simply as a matter because it has that level of institutional capability and quick response capacity due to resources and years of training for that purpose. So it's been heavily involved in these floods specifically from the very early beginning in very different kinds of rescue and relief operations, especially for reaching those hard to reach areas via helicopters and other sort of military equipment. So it's been very crucial in that. And as Ameera was mentioning, the case of increasing malaria and dengue, a close personal friend is stationed in Balochistan, and a lot of their sort of deployments, mini deployments, units and sub-unit force structures, they've been repositioned for medical relief activities, the Army Medical Corps officers. So because you have a limited amount of resources, even in the army, there's a limited amount of human personnel. So they get, they've been reassigned to the relief duties as well as medical aid duties of dealing with these increasing cases of malaria and dengue in those regions in Sindh and Balochistan specifically. And when I think of the kind of security risks we get from that, my view tends to be looking at the threats to the military. So in that area, we've seen a very notable case of the helicopter crash in Las Bela. It's like a district in Balochistan where like very high ranking officers of the military, they were in it, and unfortunately they lost their lives. So that's sort of one example of the kind of thing, security risks that the military personnel doing these activities do face. So with that in our mind, and if, looking at the projections that we have for climate-induced disasters, whether from the IPCC reports or the World Bank, the requirement for the military to conduct these HADR activities was going to increase. So let's say you have, God forbid, you don't, it's a wrong thing to hypothesize, but like, let's say you have this sort of flood every second year of this severity. Those amount of activities are going to increase. So that means however many troops you were using for these activities increases as well. And then at a certain point, you reach this threshold where after that, you are expending too many military resources for these activities and taking away from the primary responsibilities of the military, which is protecting the border regions, having the operational readiness to respond to any sort of crisis. So in the context of these floods, in my opinion, the really most severe risk that the military does face is going over that threshold in the future when the requirements of HADR from more intense and frequent flooding of this level increase. So it risks that sort of forced dilution, which can create pockets of vulnerability that are not good for the military, and then they're not good for the state, because having those bubbles of vulnerability, they can be taken advantage of. So yeah, I think that will be the biggest threat to the military security aspect of things. And then Ameera has covered, and in the blog as well, she covered those areas and I covered the military sector security areas. So yeah.
No, thank you. I mean, that phrase "pockets of vulnerability" and thinking about it that way, I think is a good framing. Andrea, I'm going to bring you in now to talk about the nuclear dimensions of this crisis, which may not be the first thing that come to mind for most casual observers. And so I wanted you to kind of walk us through how climate and nuclear risks might intersect in this case.
Sure. So starting kind of from a high level view, a nexus of threats stem from climate change and nuclear risks, overlaid on the stress of ongoing challenges such as terrorism, state fragility, and intersecting climate, nuclear, and security issues includes trends in both nuclear weapons capabilities and civilian nuclear developments, and both have consequences for the global security environment. One of these intersections centers on how a range of security and climate-related events are combining to strain nuclear weapons capable states. In Pakistan, as has been discussed, by my fellow panelists, multiple climate events have hit the country over the last several years. Deadly heat waves earlier in the year, existing governance fragility, a strained electric grid, catastrophic flooding due to climate change, also, deforestation over decades, massive dislocation, food security issues, disease outbreaks. And then you layer this over a geopolitical situation amongst 3 nuclear weapons possessing neighbors that share river resources and that share borders: Pakistan, India, and China. And they've each endured massive losses from ecological and climate-induced disasters, including rapid glacial melts, intolerable heat, extreme flooding events. Bringing this down, I would say, even further to a snapshot of kind of the regional tensions between Pakistan and India. In 2019, you had deadly skirmishes that highlighted these ongoing tensions over territorial disputes in Kashmir. These issues led to, as they have in the past, but in 2019 as well, kind of water-related threats from an Indian cabinet minister saying that they were going to block the downstream flow of water, which Pakistan is incredibly dependent on upstream India for a majority of its fresh water supply via the Indus Basin, which is experiencing and is projected to experience extreme climate impacts as well. And Further complicating this, of course, you have this historical discord between India and China. They had their own fatal confrontation between troops along their shared border in 2020. Beijing and Islamabad have close ties. China's invested heavily in Pakistan, particularly in the nuclear energy sector. And then all of this is happening at the same time as both Pakistan and India continue to bolster their respective nuclear arsenals, right? So back to the question at hand, it's, if not prepared for and handled properly, the effects of climate change may overwhelm governance mechanisms, may threaten state resiliency, may act as a threat multiplier, and lead to higher chances of miscalculated or intentional conflict escalation, especially amongst nuclear powers. And, you know, we've seen the risk of accidents or miscalculations, I would say, could be considered particularly high in this region, especially between India and Pakistan. You know, as I've mentioned, the skirmishes, there's as recently as 2020 of this year in March, there was a technical malfunction that led to an accidental firing of a missile from India into Pakistan. So this is one angle. And then kind of another climate nuclear security intersection to consider in Pakistan centers on the safety of nuclear reactors. So the threat of radiological releases as both accidents, which includes climate or disaster impacts, and also of non-state actor attacks. And that may worsen in areas of significant stress or change, right? And so Pakistan has 6 nuclear reactors, all supplied by China, with intentions to continue to build it out. There's vulnerabilities on this nuclear side. So a recent example that kind of pulling out from Pakistan, but another very pressing geopolitical issue that we're seeing that didn't have a natural disaster component, but it wouldn't be inconceivable to imagine a scenario where this could happen following kind of a complex crisis centered on a climate event, is the Russian takeover of a Ukrainian nuclear reactor, one of the largest in Europe early this year. It raised widespread alarm because the potential damage to the plant, of the concern of that causing kind of large radioactive releases to the environment. And so that could be because of physical damage to the plant, to the reactors, also loss of electric power, loss of diesel backup. So this happens during natural disasters. This could also happen during attacks. So in summary, and kind of just simply stated, it's just very clear that unrest in countries with nuclear weapons or vulnerable infrastructure, including Pakistan, is just another level of potentially catastrophic risk that we need to consider and prepare for.
Thanks, Andrea. I think the 4 of you really took us through the range of risks from the very local level to the broad geopolitical level that we're seeing from these types of climate hazards. What I want to do for the second round of questions is move us from the risk discussion to a little bit more on the solution and the opportunity discussion. How do we manage this going forward? So again, we'll move from the local to the geopolitical, and I want to start back with Ameera. Given your role and your experience as a grassroots organizer in Pakistan, how does that inform your understanding of climate security, and what needs to change going forward in terms of addressing some of these risks?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. There is a lot of disconnect between what people experience at the local level in Pakistan versus what's happening at the larger government level. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But when it comes to climate change, people who are experiencing the floods are not experiencing climate change on an individual level right now. They're experiencing homelessness, they're experiencing unemployment, they're experiencing a loss of assets in the form of crops and animals, they're experiencing hunger and thirst. But to summarize that, it's climate change. We can see that when we're looking at it from like from a bird's eye view. But for someone who's experiencing it individually, they wouldn't categorize it necessarily as climate change. They would categorize it as their like individual, the thing that they're feeling right now, whether it's disease or hunger or whatever it is. And as Andrea said, climate change is a threat multiplier, and we're seeing that in Pakistan as it affects the macro functions of the state, which including the economy, our infrastructure, which is damaged severely by the floods, up to our dams, to our roads, all sorts of infrastructure. And then our justice system, due to which we're seeing like a rise, we will see a rise in crime in major cities as well. And I don't have any stats for this, but there has been an increase in crime in Islamabad, which has been reported by my neighbors and other community members. But see, what needs to change is that we need to stop viewing climate change as a singular issue. A lot of people in Pakistan believe that climate change is a very environmental related issue. And yes, it has roots in environmentalism, but when we talk about the climate crisis, it's very much a health crisis, an economic crisis, an education crisis, security crisis, a humanitarian crisis. It's a disaster management crisis. It's an infrastructure and planning crisis. So when you have an entity that deals with climate change, like we have the Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan, we need to make sure that it has the ability to lead integrated climate action on a national level. Because unless we have all these functions, the disaster management authority, the military, the health sector, the economic sector, Ministry of Finance, or whatever, all of these stakeholders on one platform together discussing how to move forward with climate action in Pakistan and how to prevent these impacts, these increasing impacts from affecting us so severely, we need to have a mechanism for dealing with them. And for that, we need to understand that climate change is not an environmental issue anymore. It's a national security issue. It's a very much holistic issue that affects every sector of our nation state. So yeah.
No, thank you for that. And I mean, you talk about something there that we talk about a lot at the Council on Strategic Risks, the need to break down silos, right? That this isn't just a climate change problem for the climate change office, but needs to be integrated. And that's so critical, but also really hard for governments to do because it's not how they tend to organize themselves, right? So they need to think of new ways to organize. Jumaina, I'm going to turn back to you now. You know, your article talked so eloquently about the lessons that can be learned from the previous floods and previous climate disasters. You mentioned this in your opening remarks a bit. And can you talk a little bit more about how those lessons might have been applied to either abate this crisis or prevent this crisis in some ways in the beginning, but also what new lessons can we apply moving forward?
First, I just wanted to say I completely agree with Ameera that they need to think about this as a national security. It's just something I wrote in July, that this is Pakistan's major national security crisis and they need to prepare for it. And think about using, I think one of the lessons not from previous floods, but from COVID that Pakistan did successfully was having a national coordination and operations center, an NCOC model for climate change that is more sustained and then has the financial and the political investment. I think it would take Pakistan a long way in addressing the future climate disasters. And as Faraz said, this could happen every year, this could happen even every other year. And that gap year, they'll be spending playing catch up. And so trying to mitigate the risks, mitigate the disaster and address the issues and recover from the previous year's floods. So I think those are, great, tangible things that can be done immediately, learning from, the previous floods. I think a big gap that was seen is, like I said, the Pakistan Meteorological Office issued warnings, but how those warnings were translated and then on the provincial level, I think is very difficult to say. I think the warnings were issued, how general they were, how specific they were, how they were taken by on the provincial entities is important. So more technical assistance on that level. This is where the international community can play a role, is providing that type of training and technical assistance. And an easy thing for the international community to do, and in particular the United States and England, and is the scholarships. The Fulbright program for Pakistan, it's the largest one the US government has. And I know that there have been efforts to, ensure that Fulbright recipients are studying issues like science, technology, math, computers, but maybe making a more discrete focus, saying we are going to prioritize that 15% of the Fulbright recipients should be studying climate science, should be studying urban planning, disaster management, because these students have to go back to Pakistan and work. And this is where the Pakistani government could say, okay, we're going to find them jobs within the government on the national and provincial level. And the same thing with the Sheving fellowships to the UK. Though the foreign, the equivalent of USAID and in the UK can also make the same argument that we're going to prioritize these types of fellowships. And for the climate scientists and the the disaster management authorities, greater cooperation. And this has to come from the top, pushing for greater cooperation on the national level to the provincial level and within the institutions on the provincial level that are tasked with doing disaster management. Because in Pakistan, climate change and the Ministry of Climate Change is a national subject, while environment, water is and disaster management is a provincial subject. So taking down those silos, as you said, for them to work more closely together will be important. And I think just one other thing I'd like to add is that this is also a basic issue of zoning and permits for where things are constructed. And that is something that the provincial level and the local constituency level is where that plays in. For example, the video that went viral in the Swat Valley of the massive hotel being washed away. That hotel was built prior to 2010 the first time, and it was washed away in 2010, and they rebuilt it on the same area. This is where, for us as the military has a role to play. The Chief of Army Staff even said that people like this who are constructing in areas that are prone to flooding or have constructed illegally or have should be held accountable. And this is, I think, where the conversations around loss and damage also come in, which I talked about in my Just Security article, is that yes, under Paris, there is a mechanism and there should be a better process for loss and damage, but on everything of the 30 billion that the Pakistanis are estimating, for reconstruction can and should be covered by loss and damage from the international community. Some of it is a domestic political issue, and frankly, weak governance, corruption that has led to some of the damage that we are seeing throughout Pakistan from these floods.
Thanks. That was so many good, concrete actions that can be taken, which I really appreciate, especially the ideas around how do you build a climate strong workforce, right? And leadership in a country, which I think is a thing that we're struggling with here in the US and a lot of other places. So I think there are lessons to be learned and shared there. Faraz, I'm going to turn to you now to talk a little bit more about how does this crisis challenge us to rethink national security? And I know Ameera spoke to that as well. But can you talk also then, how might a new defense strategy for Pakistan reflect that kind of shift?
Yep, gladly. So to the first part, see, I feel that the issue is that we tend to not use the right framework, whether at a policy level or at an academic discourse level. What I have ended up developing a habit of is that sort of using the comprehensive security framework, where you have these 5 categories, areas of security. And the way we can think of it as, an existential national security threat is by picking apart and dissecting all the manifestations, observations, and disasters and associated effects of climate change in each and every one of those sectors. And then you can really conceptualize it as that level of a security threat, so that the policymakers can then view it as such and then take actions accordingly. A very few quick, sort of not example, but areas is that let's take this flood, this year's flood. You have very direct economic damages called the initial estimates, then the relief costs that will come after that. You then have societal and political threats, which Ameera was talking about. The people are facing issues such as homelessness and at an individual level, they're not viewing it as climate change. But what those experiences do is that if those affected communities do not get the level of adequate relief, and you see the issues of governance in those areas. So what that ends up creating in the minds of those people is that our social contract with the state is not being fulfilled. So the legitimacy and the authority that either the government or the state as a concept has, that deteriorates. And when that deteriorates, you're creating these sort of uncontrollable risks of either internal conflict, and then depending on a worst case scenario, it could lead to interstate conflict, as Andrea was mentioning, that there's so many intersecting and intervening variables that you really can't keep control of these things if they're not addressed properly. So that's, I feel, that how we need to and we should be trying to reconceptualize national security with that comprehensive security or climate security lens. In terms of coming and how a defense strategy would reflect that, in Pakistan, we sort of have these national security policy or national strategy policy. I haven't yet come across a defense strategy in the same way that the US circles have. But whatever the policy or strategy document may be, I think that the way it can reflect that is by using that analytical framework, whether it's climate security, comprehensive security, the policymakers or whoever's making the document, they need to be viewing each and every sector, whether it's development, construction, economics, national cohesion, all those different areas, they need to be viewed from the lens of climate security so that it can be integrated at every sector. It just can't be a thing of the military alone or the finance ministry alone. It needs to be integrated at that level. And the way you do that is taking climate change's area as an interdisciplinary area and bringing on board the subject experts, bring on board the climatologists, the military officials, defense experts, security analysts, academics, to help you craft a strategy that is sector specific and contextualized for each of that sector. We had this, you guys might have heard of it, the National Security Policy in 2021. It followed a similar model. I mean, I had disagreements with it because the areas it addressed of climate change was like one small section, about half a page, and that was really inadequate. But the model it used to create the document was doing these rounds of consultation with academics and researchers. So that model is very useful. All you need to do is expand the stakeholders and the sectors you're engaging and bringing on board. So by using that approach, you can sort of have your national security strategy or national security policy reflect the sort of cross-sectoral impacts of climate change, and using the climate security lens, you can then come up with some implementable policy. And the most important part of whatever that policy document or strategy document will look like, using the stakeholder engagement, what it needs to reflect is that sort of sector-specific climate change threat profile. I think it was the Department of Defense that came out with the document, climate security, like risk specific to the Department of Defense. So you need that thing at each of the sectoral levels. So the stakeholders identify what affects us, what will be affecting us, so that whatever strategy that comes from it is well-informed. And if it's well-informed, only then you can really have it be implemented. Otherwise, it's, you're shooting arrows in the sky. It's just fancy optics without anything getting done. So by being informed, you can then get to like sort of a defense strategy or policy that can reflect all these issues.
That's excellent. And I mean, it reflects such an important point that you need to make it relevant, right, to the different sectors. So they understand why it will help them do their jobs better, right, if they bring that climate lens into the work. A reminder, I'm going to turn to Andrea for some final comments, but a reminder, you can put questions in the Q&A. We've got 3 there already. I'd love to see more. So if you have anything, please pop it in there. Andrea, back to you now to talk about, we've talked a lot about what changes need to be made in Pakistan, but what changes need to be made in how, the US government perhaps is perceiving and thinking about these security risks in Pakistan and beyond.
Sure. So responding to this from this climate nuclear nexus, right? This climate security nexus. First of all, I think this aligns with what a lot of my fellow panelists have been saying, there's a clear need for deep analysis on how climate change effects may work with other stressors to increase the risks of, let's say, nuclear miscalculation or escalation, to understand conflict between or instability between nuclear weapons capable states. The US, stakeholders around the world, they have to shift their threat perceptions, I think, and preparedness efforts towards these multifaceted, complex, linear, sometimes non-linear risks, many which are essentially locked in because of past policy and governance shortcomings. We know that extreme events will be increasingly layered over pre-existing vulnerabilities, as this flood shows, as we've been seeing around the world with other events. And they're going to intersect with other risks. So a systemic approach will mitigate the worst of these outcomes. And I think this notion of converging risks, especially in the most vulnerable countries, to climate change, which includes Pakistan, this is where I think forecasting and early warning tools are needed, and kind of these practical processes for mitigating these potentially complex crises. So developing an early warning system, ideally for strategic risks and their convergence, I think is a top priority. Investing in data and machine learning and AI systems that are advancing how they can help the government, both locally, globally, anticipate and prevent the confluence of these risks. Ideally would give this a type of early warning system would ideally give analysts and decision makers on the ground a more comprehensive assessment of chronic issues and kind of generate notice for when and where these climate, nuclear, and security risks are combining. Obviously, this would require consistent funding, a setting of standards, along with transparency and cooperation, right? But I think in this particular case too, it can help with these perception issues that are very present between this trio of kind of regional nuclear armed nations, and misperception and perception is associated and exacerbated by climate change impacts, right? So I think that's a huge part of it. It's also just kind of to take it to the nuclear side, it's incredibly urgent that the US, that the international community continue to strengthen global governance and develop approaches to arms control that help mitigate nuclear weapons risks, while also at the same time understanding the complex ways in which these risks could be amplified when security, climate, and other trends combine.
Great. Thanks, Andrea, and thanks for bringing that global governance piece into the conversation as well, because I think that's really important as part of the conversation here. So now we're going to move to questions, and we've got some good ones in the chat. And the first one I'm going to start with is one I would like to build on a little bit, is the peace building implications of the flood events in Pakistan, especially vis-a-vis Pakistan's relationship with India. We talked a lot, Andrea talked a lot about the risks of misperception and tensions, but are there opportunities here as well on the geopolitical level, given this crisis? And I see, Jumaina, you've already unmuted yourself, so please jump in.
Yeah, no, this is not on the floods in particular, but the smog issue between the two Punjabs, both Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab have annual smog problems, and both are the largest provinces in the state in each of their respective countries, and that is areas where that they can find common ground to work together, lessons learned from each experience. And I think from the flooding is an opportunity as well. There were in the early days of kind of the planning around the disaster in Pakistan, the now former finance minister had even said that they are open to assistance from India in terms of food aid. Those conversations didn't go anywhere, but even India, to a lesser extent, did see flooding. You know, you were in Bangalore, you saw white collar workers going to their office buildings, working in the tech industry on tractors because of the flooding. So both countries see floods and heat waves and these other natural disasters and these environmental disasters. So they think this is something I've argued, is that despite all the tensions on the political, national security level, not only just India, Pakistan, but the region itself can work together, because Bangladesh also sees, flooding from cyclones and typhoons almost annually. Sri Lanka is also equally vulnerable to these climate change related disasters. So this is where SARC, which is kind of the South Asian regional body, can actually play a role, and it hasn't played a role in anything for years now. But environmental issues and environmental peace building is a platform that on the regional level that the countries of South Asia can come together. And even in advance of COP27, this is something that they can come together with one voice and talk about, whether it's climate justice, loss and damage issues, technical assistance and support for adaptation and mitigation. This is where the region itself can come together and speak on these international levels, and then bilaterally as well, to think about peace building areas. And this is something USIP is also expanding its work in, is the environmental peace building area. And so we are exploring how dialogues between countries can be set up to have these types of conversations, and I'm going to on the track 2 level, just have scientists, activists, policymakers work together and share these best practices in the future.
Thanks. Faraz, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, something just very quick. I was thinking about this when writing the essay piece, actually including how the Indian Pakistan can cooperate. And I feel that it again came down, I didn't include it in the piece, but it came down to that, how Pakistan and India separately and then together view climate change. Because if you view climate change as the one of the existential security threats or even a strategic threat, if you bring in the issue of nuclear security, it can honestly just be treated as a common enemy. The concept of strategic convergence, depending on how the state leadership is viewing the issue, it can lead to strategic convergence and sort of put aside those the areas of political baggage that end up bogging down any negotiation and development. So it boils down to the perceptions in the state leadership separately for their own countries, and then also in collection, because given the nature of climate change, and if it's realized as such, it could be, it's only a few steps away from India and Pakistan finding that strategic convergence to cooperate, starting with climate change and then moving forward if that works out well.
Thank you both for that. I'm going to combine a couple questions here about the role of the military generally in both HADR response. So there's a question as whether HADR is doctrinally a primary mission of the Pakistani military, or is it a secondary, quote, lesser included mission, which is what it is for the US military. And do you think that this event will alter that mission orientation and kind of strategic planning for the military overall? There's also a question, given the controversial historic role of the military in Pakistani politics, is there things to think about in ensuring that climate security approaches, don't strengthen the military at the expense of civil forces, right? And how do we think about that going forward? So would any of you like to jump in on those questions? Either one of them? Faraz?
Yeah. Yeah, to the first question, I haven't read like a doctrinal document which says categorizes Army's flood relief operation HADI as like a primary or lesser purpose, but sort of based off just looking at it historically and how, considering all the different functions it does, theoretically does, should be doing, and in operation does. HADR is a secondary thing where the military is expected to be called upon for any sort of national emergency, and that's sort of enshrined in law that the civil government. So like when the military does HADR operation, it's not like the chief of army staff just makes a decision in the morning and says that I'm going to start this. The civil government calls the military in by like an official order that now you have to respond. We need the help of military in aid of civil security and civil structures to help us respond to this. So it happens through that mechanism. And over the years, it's become this sort of primary, secondary function where each corps headquarters, so I don't know what the equivalent of that is in the US, but like a corps is a major military formation. So each corps headquarters has a flood relief center where things such as this are coordinated. So it's one portion of the activities in operation. It's not the primary thing. And I doubt that this will result in a rethink doctrinally for the military, because it has a lot of other things to consider and work on. So I doubt that it will result in that change, even though I think that it should, but I doubt that it will happen.
Anyone else on this question? Okay. Jumaina, I know you had some questions for your fellow panelists, so I wanted to let you jump in with those.
Yeah, no, especially to Ameera and to Faraz, but also Andrea. So there's been, discussions and conversations, especially on, with extremist groups, and I think it was raised a little bit, with the vis-a-vis the nuclear issue, but extremist groups, terrorist groups taking advantage of the chaos really that the country is seeing. Do you, especially Faraz and Ameera, I would love to hear if you think that this is a threat that is a real threat for Pakistan, because there has been an upsurge in Taliban attacks more generally in Pakistan. But being on the ground, are you seeing any inkling that this could be a larger issue moving forward, especially as as Ameera said, that it's going to take 6 to 9 months in places for the floodwaters to recede. The weather is getting colder, and people aren't getting the adequate relief. And this is where some religious groups that have arms, extremist arms, are able to provide relief efforts where the government has failed. And we saw some of this in COVID. But I would love to hear your take on where you see the trajectory of this particular risk.
Roz, would you like to go first?
Yeah, just very quickly because I was at this roundtable like 2 weeks ago and was talking to like a co-panelist, and he was mentioning that he's from the KPK region, right? And whenever in the past there's been any sort of disaster, whether it's flood or any other thing, um, the amount of relief is never enough for the affectees. So there's always a group that these non-state actors can take advantage of by coming in and saying that we have the governance structure, we have the relief things to provide you with, and they take advantage of the fault line. So using that as the base of the argument and then looking at it conceptually, if these fault lines are being exacerbated, whether in terms of not enough food being provided, not enough shelters being provided, you're creating or sort of increasing those fault lines. So a non-state actor with that sort of malicious intent can very easily take advantage of that. I haven't seen any reportage on this in relation to the flood event, but I'm very sure that using past trends and past instances, it's very possible that this will sort of aid their efforts in terms of campaigning and inducting people into whatever plans they have in mind. Yeah.
Just to add on to that, I think that if anything like that is to happen to Pakistan, it would probably happen after these flood relief efforts die down and things are relatively slower in response rate, because that's when we'll be seeing a bigger unrest in the form of people who are homeless right now. They come out of shock and then they realize what's happened to them and sort of, take not control of the situation, but sort of gauge their situation in their own way. But yeah, as for reports on anything like this, I haven't seen anything like that yet.
But I would assume that it doesn't bode well, especially that general elections are supposed to take place before next October, and there's no way, given the scale of the disaster, that you're going to see any tangible dent in the recovery efforts. So I can see this being a major issue within political campaigns next year.
Yeah. And a good reminder that this isn't, I mean, we need to think about these risks over a longer term period too. It's not just right now, but over the next 6 months, year, 5 years down the road, really. Okay, I've got a couple of questions here on improving resilience. One is if there are opportunities for private capital to help improve resilience at the national and local level. And then another question about what initiatives are in action now that are helping support sustainable development, nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, etc. Are there initiatives that are bridging gaps between political decisions and community needs, kind of that national and local level? And how is sustainable development approached in post-catastrophe situations? So if anyone wants to take on some of those questions. Yeah, Ameera.
Yeah, so we've seen that the 2010 floods happened on a similar scale, lesser but similar scale. And there were a lot of reports made, a lot of work done on sustainable development afterwards, but there was no tangible outcome of those preparations that, or the steps that experts said that we should take. And I think the problem is, again, that we work a lot in silos. So I know that there's work being done on climate adaptation in the Ministry of Planning and Infrastructure. And I know that there's work being done in the Ministry of Climate Change, and people like Faraz are doing research independently on climate and military security. So there's a lot of work being done that I see working in the sustainability office at NUST. Even within NUST, there is so much work being done on sustainability, and people don't know, the people who are working on it don't know that it relates to sustainability, which is insane to me. So I have to go around telling researchers that the work that you're doing is actually connected to this sustainable development goal, and it comes under sustainability. And they're like, oh, really? I didn't know that. You're researching on it. So it's this sort of thing that I think that needs to be localized, contextualized. People need to understand what we mean when we're talking about sustainability, because for a lot of people over here, it's just a buzzword. So I think it's important that we, the work that I'm doing, I focus on contextualizing information that comes from the West or comes from the internet, essentially, to local levels and especially to youth audiences, so that we understand what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change. Now, the conversation that we're having right now is probably inaccessible to a lot of Pakistanis, especially since it's in English. So these are the sort of issues that I see in Pakistan. And yes, there is work being done, but there is no way that I or anyone can contextualize or like list down everything that's being done, because a lot of people who are working on it don't even know that they're working on it. So yeah.
Thanks. No, those are some really important points that you bring up. I think we have time for maybe two more of our questions here, and we've got some good ones. Andrea, I wanted to turn to you. There's a question about what areas of research maybe need to be explored more in terms of conflict over water or shared river basins between India and Pakistan right now, and if you have thoughts on that based on your research, and others too.
Sure.
Can
I think that there's a guarantee that there's going to be an increase in volatility and kind of an inability to be able to predict necessarily when these extreme events are going to happen, but we know they're going to be extreme and we know they're going to be volatile, right? So we at CSR, not a study on Pakistan, but it was a study on China and India's this nexus in particular, so the climate nuclear security nexus, and looking at what climate change impacts over the next, let's say, few decades is going to look like, and that how that's going to impact glacial melt, freshwater runoff, things like that. I think in the case of Pakistan and India, that kind of study is needed, as well as you have a lot, because there's this rhetoric of control of water and the Indus River Basin, and how the treaties are split between Pakistan and the rivers are split, the resources between both. I think that there needs to be more research in climate impacts, so seeing over the next few decades what's expected in terms of glacial melt, and also not to be conservative, right? So we're looking at this like, oh, okay, if it's 1 degree, no, I think we need to look at the most extreme events as well, so that we can be prepared for what that's actually going to look like, and flooding events and things like that. So I think that there's a need for research, and there's, in terms of the climate science and what that could look like, overlaid over the existing fragilities, right? So also looking at how the treaty that's in place, what that would look like if certain things were to happen in this scenario, what would happen, that kind of deeper analysis I think is very much needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would put a plug in for the kind of scenarios, tabletop exercises that we like to do at the Council on Strategic Risk, because I think that's how you help people think through those more extreme scenarios that you mentioned. Faraz and Ameera, you both have your hands up.
Yeah, just very quickly, what Andrea was saying, I was gonna say that the water issue between the two countries, this notion of water wars between India and Pakistan, it needs to be looked at and overlaid with all the other issues, like the climate security issue, and she did mention that. I just wanted to add that saying that we do need research on this. I just wanted to, I mean, it could be a shameless plug, but my thesis, 1/4 of the thesis is looking at that. So covering the comprehensive security issues, but then seeing it on an academic level and then backed up by primary data and like interviews, that how the water issue, or just like specific scarcities of water between India and Pakistan, can eventually, or hypothetically, not just cause internal conflict, but interstate conflict, because the water issue of the Indus Water Treaty won't be acting alone. It'll be acting in conjunction with all these other issues, or those pockets of vulnerability that I mentioned before. So these things together happening at the same time really do create that potential of either creating or exacerbating interstate conflict. So that sort of work, I mean, at least at our university, that is being done, but on an academic level, not at like sort of a tabletop policy level, but hopefully, academic research does lead into the more policy circles of things. Yeah.
Yeah, so my opinion is that water is highly politicized in Pakistan, especially in Pakistan. I don't know about India, because I'm recently into public policy. But yeah, so a little insight on the facts and figures of water usage in Pakistan. Yes, fresh water is important, but 60% of over 60% of our irrigation is done through groundwater. 93% of our domestic use is through groundwater, and 100% of our industrial water use is through groundwater. And yet, when our politicians are speaking on water, all they can talk about is the Indus Water Treaty. So it is a little misleading as well to the general public, because when we're focusing on the Indus Water Treaty, when we're focusing on fresh water and surface water, there's a lot of talk about dams and storage solutions like that. But those dams don't even, the dams that we have, they're some of the biggest dams in our region, I guess, the Serbela Dam, for example, and they cover maybe like 5% of our water usage. So it's really important to for the general public and as well as international audiences to know that there's a lot of politicization behind the water issue. This is like my degree, so I can speak a lot about water. But yeah, there's the water crisis needs to be academically handled, I think, because groundwater is our main resource that we use, and there is no research, next to no research being done on groundwater replenishment. So when we're talking about conservation and just water treating and sort of using surface water, in a productive way, we're not talking about how to, replenish our groundwater resources and sort of add to the resource that we're already using. So yeah.
No, yeah, politics are inescapable, right? And no matter what the physical risks are, the politics play a huge role. We're at the top of the hour, but I'd love to give Jumaina just one, if you want to have a last word here on any observations or maybe a positive note going forward to leave us with as we finish the conversation.
I think two things. One, I'm glad that there was a conversation about the Indus Water Treaty. And yes, unfortunately, the politicians do point to it, but it's one of the things that actually has had resilience. Despite the tensions between the two countries, between India and Pakistan, the Indus Water Commission continues to meet. And again, that is a platform where I think can be replicated for climate change issues. And I think, despite the horror and the stories we're seeing, like Ameera mentioned, children especially, there is, at least in Sindh alone, there were, I think, 80,000 women that were due to give birth over the next 2 months. The community has come together in Pakistan and around the world to realize that this is a problem not just for Pakistan, but the Secretary General said, today it's Pakistan, tomorrow it could be anyone else's country. And I think the fact that the floods have elevated the issue onto the international level, and unfortunately the timing for those discussions works because COP is happening in November, that the conversations between activists, between governments, could become richer instead of more, acrimonious as we've seen over the last few years. And so this is a time for the international community to come together, work with activists, civil society, academics, and other governments. I hate to use the terms global north and global south, but that's what's the buzzwords that are used, to really come together and chart a way forward. Because like we're seeing in the US, this is not just a global problem outside the US. The US is also facing these issues. And this is where real leadership can be taken by the US, and in potentially working together with the Pakistani foreign minister just here. And he spoke at USIP, he spoke at the Wilson Center and other places over the past weeks. He is actually calling for reduced tensions. This is some place where the US and China could potentially work together, according to the foreign minister, on climate change issues. Even if they can't agree on anything else or work on anything else, this is one area where there could be convergence, strategic convergence, the term Faraz used, and charting a way forward and addressing it, because it's not something that we need to worry about 20 years down the road. It's something we need to worry about now.
Thank you so much. Those were excellent closing remarks, and I think left us in a positive place for thinking about where we go from here. Thank you all for joining us today. This has been an excellent conversation. I apologize I didn't get to all the questions in the Q&A. There were so many, and so many good ones. Ameera, Faraz, Jumaina, Andrea, thank you again. I learned a lot, and please stay in touch with the Center and the Council on Strategic Risk going forward, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Erin.